Welcome back. Now, in a moment, we'll find out if a bad mobile connection is holding back the economy in developing countries. But first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. The UK Suez Fraud Office has charged Barclays Bank with conspiracy to commit fraud. 4 former top executives will also face criminal charges for taking billions of dollars from Qatari investors during the 2008 financial crisis. Barclays said it was considering its position and awaiting further information about the charges. A group of prominent journalists in Mexico has filed a criminal complaint against the government for illegally accessing their private communications. The accusation follows the release of a news report saying their smartphones had been infected with spying software. A Mexican government spokesman categorically denied the allegations. And the Australian military has temporarily suspended air missions over Syria following the shooting down of a Syrian jet by US forces. Russia said it would treat any US-led coalition aircraft flying west of the river Euphrates in Syria as a potential target. So back to communications technology now. In the first part of the programme, we talked about the huge economic opportunities that could follow the launch of 5G, the next generation in mobile data. But large parts of the world still rely on 3G or even 2G technology, which dates back to the 1990s. Insight's Chloe Culpan has some more details.
According to the GSMA, the body representing mobile operators around the world, nearly 70% of sub-Saharan Africa was using 2G last year. 30% were using 3G and just 2% were using 4G. But by 2020, nearly half of mobile users will be on a 3G network and more than 10% will be able to use 4G. In Europe, 3G was the most used network in 2016, but in 3 years' time, more than half will be on 4G. In North America, already 60% are on a 4G network, but by 2020, that number will rise to more than 80%, with virtually no one using 2G.
Well, Mark Giles from GSMA, the body representing mobile phone operators, is still with me in the studio. This situation regarding fast broadband across the developing world, I guess apart from China, there's still a pretty low 4G reception, isn't there, across the rest of the developing world?
I mean, yeah, in terms of adoption, 4G is available in most markets worldwide now. There's, some markets still launching, but in terms of the actual number of people using it, it's still, a minority in these markets.
Yeah, in India, I was reading that something like 80% of the Indian population still have basic GSM phones, Absolutely. So they're all on the 2G. I guess that's a problem because some countries are actually actively starting to close down their 2G networks.
Indeed, yeah, sunsetting them so they can free up the airwaves to support new generation technologies. No, absolutely. I think there's a number of things at play here. Number one is governments and regulators making the spectrum available and licensing it off to operators so they can actually launch the services. So that's one potential bottleneck, and you've seen it in places like Jordan. Egypt recently has launched 4G. I think Turkey was last year, and in places like that, Turkey in particular, has followed in China's footsteps in a way, and the adoption of 4G has been quite staggering. There is that kind of pent-up demand in a way.
There's massive demand. I mean, Africa, I was looking at, across African countries, a real embracing of the mobile phone technology. They have apps for sending money, sending parcels, even buying cows. But at the moment, being able to get fast broadband is really patchy. So how does the industry solve this problem?
Sure. Well, I think that, we've got to think of how they're using it as well, because a lot of technology is kind of rolled out in blanket, and we assume that people will use it the same way they do in the UK or elsewhere. And the services such as you talked about, like mobile money services and farmers, for example, and understanding what the local prices are for crops, that kind of information sharing is perfectly fine via a 2G or a 3G phone. And 3G technology has come a long way, so the latest generation is quite cheap to deploy, or it was quite cheap to deploy, and offers pretty good download rates. But then there are more fundamental issues in terms of getting people onto 4G networks. There's an affordability issue. So 4G handsets tend to be priced at a premium to 3G. Now gap has narrowed massively.
But isn't this something that the operators, they can actively choose to make phones available much more cheaply, can't they?
They can, but they need to be careful that the business model stacks up. And this comes to the same thing with coverage. But, with smartphones, we've seen some innovative examples of operators in sub-Saharan Africa offering some level of subsidies, which is what we're used to, a lot in the West, or handset financing, where we pay off the phone in installments over the length of a contract. There's some examples of that in sub-Saharan Africa, but there's people there who don't have bank accounts. There's people there who are still unable to afford that level of expense. So it's still a barrier. In order to get over it, we need to stimulate economic growth. We need to continue to look at how innovative ways we can get smartphones into their hands, but also, again, look at how they're using it. There's no point in pushing these handsets into people's hands if, we think they're going to be streaming high definition.
Yeah, the number of people online is still low in developing world compared to the rest of the world. There's something like only 17% have access to mobile broadband. So should the government be playing a part in freeing up that potential?
I think so. This has to be a partnership approach. You've seen a lot of sub-Saharan African markets where the government regulator has issued a load of licenses. You've had maybe 5, 6, 7 operators hit the market. And that level of competition is unsustainable if you want to build economies of scale. So we've got too many operators fighting over, too few subscribers with quite relatively low ARPU. There's a lot governments can do, from looking at how they auction their spectrum. Operators typically pay a lot of money to acquire spectrum, but regulators and governments need to assess that and make sure that it still supports rollout after the sale.
And all of this is worth doing, because we were talking in the first half of the programme about how this benefits economic growth. Analysts are saying that if African countries, for example, can unlock the potential, this could be a fourth industrial revolution. I mean, do you think it could go that far?
I think it'll take time. It'll take a long time, and 5G, will be rolled out in some African markets, but it's likely to be confined to dense urban areas. In terms of mobile's impact, it's already having a massive impact in a lot of these markets.
But even getting 4G coverage in some kind of regular and more consistent way, 4G coverage the way we have it here now in the developed world, would that unlock Africa's economy to a greater extent? It
would. It would allow the kind of innovation you're seeing in developed markets, where people, are creating apps and new experiences for people. You'd have, you see in a lot of countries outside the US, they kind of replicate some of the business models that have been established there, and you have big global companies like WhatsApp and Viber and all the rest of it. You start to see some of those from sub-Saharan Africa serving local needs of people there. And there's a lot of programs. We have a huge division within the GSMA, Mobile for Development, who's focused on kind of incubating those kind of startups, working to understand the needs of people there and to help deliver tech, but also to look at how we get that coverage out there as well, and how we work with operators and regulators to make that happen.
I mean, in terms of that, America is so far ahead. We all seem to be behind the curve when it comes to the US. Have they just got their stuff sorted out better?
I think so. Well, Asia is also, when you look at China, and in particular South Korea and Japan and places like Australia, they're also on a par with the US. And the US was very quick to launch 4G. And the regulator there was massively supportive. Spectrum was assigned really early, so operators just had a clear field in which to run. In Europe, it's been more difficult. You have there's a lot of countries it's difficult to build scale. Spectrum was released relatively later. So we have been playing catch up with the US, but that's to a degree what 5G is about for Europe. It's about leveling the playing field. That's why there's massive ambition around the world to launch in and around 2020 and to really accelerate the development of 5G.
I suppose in reality, there are massive obstacles in developing countries. For example, a large number of people in Africa or remote Asian villages don't have access to grid electricity. So those kind of things are holding back the development of what could be quite revolutionary for their
Absolutely. One of the most interesting examples I've come across is in Myanmar. You know, back in 2014, or prior to 2014, you had a single operator. It was a monopoly. SIM cards cost $2,500 US, and in a developing country like Myanmar, it meant that penetration was, you know, virtually no one had one. And it's you know, predominantly a farming, agricultural market, 30 million farmers out of a population of around 50 million. But then in 2014, that all changed. It was $2.50 to get a SIM card. Cheap smartphones flooded the market, and people got access to the internet for the first time. You know, no fixed infrastructure before. And that's coincided with the development of the economy. So the government there has been actively rolling out and electricity coverage, or utilities to support the growth in the economy. So these two things are going hand in hand, and looking at some of the ways that people are using mobile phones over there is really intriguing. They see Facebook as the internet, a lot of them, and it's their way of keeping up with news and local affairs. It's not so much a means to share photos and things with their friends. So it's really interesting to look at that as an analyst.
You can almost see the development of the whole country based on how far they're using the internet and using mobile phone technology. Mark, it's been great to speak with you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Now we're going to end with our Insight Bite, a little something that we feel you should know. So we've been hearing about self-driving cars. What about self-flying planes? The world's biggest aircraft maker, Boeing, says with demand for global travel soaring, more than 600,000 new pilots will be needed over the next 20 years. Well, to reduce that number, they're testing new technology which would see artificial intelligence making some of the decisions usually made by pilots. And it could be tested on a real aircraft as soon as next year. But are we really going to want to fly on a pilotless plane? I'll leave that to you. That's all for now. I'm Sheila Ghosh. That was Insight.